Chapter 13. The Iranian Revolution of 1905 to 1911. Popular discontent erupted in spontaneous outbreaks of unrest, which in the early years, 20th century happened almost every year. In June 1900, the Russian envoy in Tehran reported that the latent discontent that exists among the population of Persia against the government and has a constant source of self-will and self-interest of the upper classes and ruling circles, along with the defenselessness of the lower strata, breaks out in the most diverse forms. In 1900, in connection with the famine in Tehran and other cities of Iran, unrest took place. In August 1901, unrest again took place in Tehran. They were caused by popular discontent with the unpopular Prime Minister Amina Sultan, who was accused of betraying the interests of the country to foreigners, as well as the activities of Belgian customs officials who inflated food prices. In 1903, in Tehran, Tabriz, Yazd and other cities, there were protests against customs agreements and a new customs tariff. The Tabrizians, led by the clergy, demanded that the Shah cancel customs agreements, expel the director of Azerbaijani customs, the Belgian Prim, dismissal of all non-Muslim employees of the post and telegraph, and close to the school where foreign languages were taught. The leading participation of the clergy left a certain imprint on these demands, which are basically anti-imperialist. In 1903 to 1904, famine raged in Iran, in connection with which speculation in bread, spoilage of bread, etc., developed widely. Etc. The people smashed grain and meat warehouses and shops owned by speculators. Leaflets against Prime Minister Atabek Azam were distributed in Tehran and other cities. He was openly accused of embezzlement, bribery and being an agent of foreign powers. Under pressure from this movement, the Shah dismissed Atabek Azam and appointed another ardent reactionary, Ained Dol, as prime minister. But this change of prime minister did not lead to a change in the Shah's policy and the situation in the country. The excitement among the people increased the more. On November 18, 1905, Russian chargé d'affaires Somoov reported from Tehran to St. Petersburg. Agitation against foreigners. They took everything into their own hands in Persia, and the Persians themselves are forced to beg. Somoov reported that the agitation at that time was directed mainly against the director of customs, the Belgian Naes, who was accused of stealing from the treasury and merchants. As a result of this agitation, the government was forced to give Naes a business trip abroad, to Turkey, to negotiate a new Persian-Turkish trade agreement. Somoov also reported on speeches against foreign banks, and a boycott of banknotes issued by the English Shahanshah Bank, which the clergy intended to declare unclean, so that the faithful would not touch them. In Tehran, Somoov wrote, "Several talented preachers have appeared who thrash foreigners, but speak with no less harshness about the internal administration of Iran. One of them stands out in particular, Said Jemal, whom thousands of people gather to listen to every day. He also speaks in the mosque against the Shah and the government. In Persia, he says, according to ancient custom, there is a law to cut off the hand for theft, but it applies only to the poor. Tell me honestly, if this law were applied impartially, would it not be necessary to cut off the hands of everyone, from the Shah to the last official? But they do not do this, and this is the misfortune of Persia. Laws must be equal for all." This dispatch from Somoov vividly testifies to the tense situation in Iran in 1905. In 1905, spontaneous popular discontent began to take on organizational forms. Mass revolutionary organizations of mujahideen, fighters for a just, revolutionary cause, began to be created in the cities of northern Iran. The fact that these organizations first appeared in the northern regions of Iran was due to the influence of the revolutionary movement in Russia, and also to that these regions of Iran were the most economically developed. The impact of the revolutionary struggle in Russia was felt in Iran even before the beginning of the revolution of 1905. This impact was carried out primarily through the Iranian art-khadniks in Transcaucasia, mainly in Baku. In 1904, there were about 7,000 Iranian workers in Baku, which accounted for approximately 22% of all Baku workers. Work in the Transcaucasus, especially in the Baku industries, among the Baku workers, whose revolutionary struggle was led by the Transcaucasian Bolsheviks, headed by Comrade Stalin. Participation in the strikes of the Baku workers, all this revolutionized the workers, immigrants from Iran. As early as 1904, on the initiative of Comrade Stalin, the Social Democratic Group, Gumet, was created to conduct mass work among the Azerbaijani workers. This organization was headed by M. Azizbekov and A. Japarides. There was a close relationship between the Baku Committee of the Bolsheviks and the Gumet organization. Returning from Baku to their homeland, Iranian Artkartniks carried with them the ideas of a revolutionary struggle against the Shah, feudal lords and imperialism. Proximity with Russia and close ties with it contributed to the growth of democratic ideas in Iran and the development of the revolutionary movement. Naturally, in the conditions of the extreme aggravation of social contradictions in Iran and the great influence of the Russian revolutionary movement on this country, the defeat of Russian Tsarism in the war with Japan and the Russian Revolution of 1905 gave a powerful impetus to the revolutionary movement in Iran. In the article The Awakening of Asia, Lenin wrote, "Following the Russian movement of 1905, the democratic revolution swept the whole of Asia. World capitalism and the Russian movement of 1905 finally awakened Asia. Hundreds of millions of the downtrodden, run wild in medieval stagnation, the population woke up to a new life and to the struggle for elementary human rights, for democracy." The mass movement in Iran began immediately after the Russian Revolution of 1905. The events in Kerman and Tehran were the immediate cause. In Kerman, the best was broken in the house of a mujtahid. Those who sat down in the best were arrested and beaten by order of the governor. In Tehran, on the orders of Prime Minister Ained Dole, several merchants were seized and beaten on the heels with sticks. These actions of the authorities caused an explosion of popular indignation. In December 1905, mass demonstrations and general strikes of protest took place in Tehran, Tabriz, Shiraz and other cities. Bazaars, shops, workshops were closed, trade and, in general, all economic activity ceased. The demonstrators demanded that the Prime Minister, the reactionary Ained Dole, a relative of the Shah, be removed from the management of state affairs, as well as reforms. The demonstrations were very violent. In Tehran, Tabriz and other cities, they ended in clashes with the police and troops. The demonstrations were led by the clergy. After the authorities tried to arrest several prominent preachers, on December 14, 1905, the highest Tehran clergy, headed by 5,000 artisans, merchants, students of religious schools and the more, settled in the best in the Shah Abdulazim Mosque near Tehran. Those who sat down in the best turned to the people with an appeal, in which the Shah's government was declared the culprit of all the people's troubles and misfortunes. The appeal put forward demands for the resignation of Ained Dole, reforms and the immediate convening of a legislative assembly of people's representatives. By this time, discontent had also engulfed the military units. In a dispatch dated December 30, 1905, Somu reported that individual parts of the Persian troops openly declared that they would not comply with the order to attack the clergy, if any. In early January 1906, frightened by the growth of the popular movement, Mozaffar ad-Din Shah made concessions. He promised to start reforms, convene a legislative institution elected from the clergy, merchants and landowners, the House of Justice, dismiss the unpopular governor of Tehran, promised to punish the governor of Kerman, who punished them all with stick blows, and created an elected council of residents in Tehran to determine prices for food products. After that, the clergy left the best and returned to Tehran, where they were solemnly welcomed by the population. But the Shah tried in every possible way to delay the fulfillment of his promises. It was not until March 1906 that a commission was formed from senior dignitaries and mujtahids to develop regulations on the legislative assembly and other reforms. This commission did nothing on its own, but appointed a subcommittee of 7 people, which was also practically inactive. After the Shah had done nothing throughout the first half of 1906 to fulfill his promises, it became clear that he was deceiving the people. In response to the perfidious tactics of the Shah's authorities, in June and July 1906, popular unrest and demonstrations began again in Tehran and other cities. Crowded rallies gathered in bazaars, squares and mosques. When the authorities arrested one of the most prominent preachers, Sheikh Mohammed, and several other agitators, the mob attacked the prison, trying to free them. The Shah again sent troops and police against the demonstrators, who opened fire on them. Then the artisans and merchants of Tehran closed their shops in the bazaar, and several thousand people sat down in the best in the garden of the English mission. Merchants took upon themselves the expenses for the maintenance of those who sat down in the best. At the same time, in protest against the actions of the Shah's authorities, the Tehran clergy left the capital and went to the city of Qom, from where the Shah was presented with demands to convene a parliament, resign Ayned-Dole and other prominent reactionaries, dismiss Belgian customs officials, etc. The clergy threatened to completely leave Iran if the Shah does not satisfy these demands. Demonstrations were also held in other cities of Iran, bazaars were closed and the population got into the best. The population of Tabriz demanded that a constitution be introduced within 2 days, threatening revolt otherwise. The movement assumed very formidable proportions. The Shah was forced to yield. Through the mediation of an English chargé d'affaires, he began negotiations with the best. On July 30, Ayned-Dole was resigned. The liberal Nasrollah Khan Moshied-Dole, popular in nationalist circles, was appointed prime minister. On August 5, 1906, the Shah's decree on the introduction of a constitution was published. After that, the clergy returned from Qom to Tehran, best in the garden of the English mission also ceased. Thus, at the head of the constitutional movement in Iran, in 1905 to 1906, there was a Muslim clergy, whose economic and political position in the country was undermined in connection with the attempts of the Shah to introduce a new order of justice. The external Europeanization of some aspects of Iranian life and other circumstances. The clergy hoped to use the constitution to secure for themselves the political rights and privileges they were beginning to lose. The British, in the initial period of the constitutional movement, proceeding from selfish interests, sought to use it to weaken the positions of Tsarist Russia, whose representatives had great influence on the Shah. The British hypocritically portrayed themselves as supporters of the constitutional movement only in order to strengthen their position in Iran in opposition to Tsarist Russia. In reality, the British did their best to preserve the backwardness of the economic and political system of Iran and prevent democratic reforms that could strengthen Iran. On September 9, 1906, the Shah signed a regulation on the establishment of a meeting of the National Council, the Majlis, and on the procedure for elections to the Majlis. This provision established 2-stage elections according to the curial system. 6 curia were established: 1. Princes and members of the Khaja family, 2. Clergy, 3. Feudal aristocracy, 4. Merchants, 5. Landowners and farmers, and 6. Artisans. The right to vote was granted to Iranian citizens who had reached the age of 25. A property qualification was established for the rural population to own land worth at least 1,000 fogs, for merchants and artisans to own their own shop. Thus, the law disenfranchised all workers, peasants, most artisans, and even the less wealthy part of the merchant bourgeoisie. Women were also disenfranchised. For those elected, additional restrictions were established: age from 30 to 70 years, literacy, no accusations or suspicions of committing crimes, etc. The number of deputies was not to exceed 200, of which 60 were to be elected from Tehran. The Mejlis could begin its work after the end of the elections from Tehran, without waiting for the arrival of deputies from the provinces. In the districts where elections were taking place, commissions of representatives of all curie were to be set up to oversee the correct conduct of the elections. After the elections in Tehran were completed, on October 7, a solemn meeting of the First Iranian Majlis was held. Then deputies from the provinces began to arrive. The deputies of the First Majlis included representatives of the feudal aristocracy, merchants, landlords, clergy, and several artisans and officials. Meetings of the Majlis were public. The public not only attended the meetings, but also intervened in the debate, introduced questions for discussion, etc. Reports on the meetings of the Mejlis were published in newspapers and widely discussed at the bazaar. Issues at meetings of the Majlis were introduced and discussed not according to plan, but spontaneously, randomly. The debate was often very stormy, and it came almost to fights. The leading role in the first Majlis was played by the higher clergy. Without prior approval from the two most prominent mujtahids, Sayyid Muhammad Tabatabai and Sayyid Abdollah Babekani, not a single important issue was resolved by the Majlis. Despite its shortcomings, the first Iranian Majlis, both in terms of the composition of its deputies and the nature of its activities, was the most progressive of all the subsequent convocations of the Majlis. Its composition and activities were affected by the fact that it was created in the first period of the revolution, when the liberal landowners, the clergy and the merchant bourgeoisie opposed the Shah and the imperialists, together with the democratic sections of the people. More or less radical representatives of these sections of the population were elected to the Mejlis. In addition, the wave of popular movement, which rose higher and higher, had a strong influence on the first Majlis. The focus of the Majlis in 1906 was the development of a constitution. The development of the draft constitution proceeded in the conditions of an intensified struggle with the Shah's heir, the reactionary Muhammad Ali, who from the autumn of 1906 ruled Iran on behalf of his seriously ill father Mozaffar al-Din Shah, and tried in every possible way to limit the constitutional rights of the Majlis. On December 30, 1906, Mozaffar ad-Din Shah approved the first part of the constitution, the Basic Law, which determined only the basic rights and duties of the Majlis. Then the supplements to the Basic Law were developed and approved in October 1907 by the new Shah Muhammad Ali, which was the most important part of the Iranian constitution. The constitution declared that all power came from the people. The power of the Shah, according to the constitution, was limited by the parliament, the Majlis, or the meeting of the National Council, Majlis Shurei Melli, as it is officially called in Iran. The Majlis had the right to approve all laws and the country's budget, and control their implementation. The Shah, according to the constitution, could only temporarily suspend the operation of the law approved by the Majlis and dissolve the Majlis. But if the newly elected Majlis confirms the decision of the dissolved one, then the Shah was obliged to approve the controversial law. The constitution, additions to the Basic Law, prohibited the granting of concessions, the conclusion of loans, treaties and agreements with foreign states without the consent of the Majlis. Along with the lower chamber, the Majlis, it was planned to create an upper chamber, the Senate. The principle of separation of powers, legislative, executive and judicial, as well as the principle of government responsibility to the Majlis, was established. The constitution proclaimed the inviolability of the person, property, home, and the secrecy of private correspondence. It was envisaged to organize, along with Sharia, spiritual courts, secular courts. The freedom of education, press, societies and unions, limited by the condition not to contradict the foundations of Islam, was declared. The constitution provided for the formation of provincial and regional enjuman councils, whose members were to be elected directly by the population. Shiite Islam was proclaimed the official state religion of Iran. In general, the clergy received very broad rights under the constitution. In addition to control over public education, the press and societies, the higher clergy essentially received the rights of the supreme legislative authority. The constitution provided for the creation, on the proposal of the higher clergy, of a permanent commission of at least 5 higher clergy, which was supposed to decide whether a particular bill submitted and adopted by the Majlis corresponds to the spirit of Islam. Without the prior approval of the commission, the Shah could not approve a single law. The clergy used their leadership role in the first stage of the constitutional movement and secured for themselves broad rights and benefits under the constitution. At the same time, the Iranian constitution denied the working masses, all workers and peasants, most artisans, and all women, the right to participate in the political life of the country. The introduction of the constitution was a major concession on the part of the reactionary ruling clique and the Shah. But the liberal landlords and the bourgeoisie took advantage of this concession, removing the broad masses of the people from solving state affairs and depriving them of political rights. In addition to the adoption of the constitution, the first Majlis, without affecting the foundations of feudal land tenure, carried out some progressive measures and reforms of the state system in the bourgeois spirit. The Majlis achieved the liquidation of the tax-paying system and tiles. He was also involved in the regulation of prices for bread and meat. At the request of the Majlis, the reactionary Asaf Dole was removed from the post of governor of Khorasan, the director of customs, the Belgian Naus, and others were dismissed. Measures were taken to organize secular courts, chambers of commerce, and local self-government. The Majlis paid much attention to financial issues. The expenses of the Shah's court were significantly cut, and the pensions of the Khaja princes were reduced. The Majlis rejected the conclusion of a new foreign loan, suggesting that the government resort to mobilizing domestic funds in Iran. In this regard, some members of the Majlis introduced a project to create an Iranian national bank in opposition to the English Shahanshah Bank. On March 30, 1907, the charter of the National Bank was approved. The authors of the project tried to raise the capital of the bank by subscription among the population. But in this way it was not possible to raise the necessary amount. The rich signed, but did not contribute money. In total, only about 5,000 fogs were collected. Attempts to obtain abroad the capital necessary for the foundation of the bank were also unsuccessful. The English Shahanshah Bank put up all sorts of obstacles to the establishment of the Iranian National Bank. Therefore, the project to create the National Bank remained unfulfilled. The Majlis was also engaged in the reform of the tax system, received and analyzed the complaints of the population, etc. The revolution stirred up the broad masses of the people of Iran. Workers, peasants, the urban poor and the petty bourgeoisie began to enter the arena of political struggle with their own slogans and demands. This activation of the broad masses of the people found its expression in the growth of the spontaneous peasant movement and the movement of workers. In the organization of the Revolutionary Society of the Mujahideen, in the organization of the Anjumans, detachments of Fidai. Fidai is a person who is ready to sacrifice his life for a just cause. In this case, for the cause of the revolution, in the emergence of a large number of newspapers and in other forms. As early as 1906, the spontaneous movement of the peasants began to expand. At first, it was deployed in the northern provinces of Iran adjacent to Russia, Azerbaijan, Gilan, Mazandaran, Astrabad and Khorasan, but then spread to the south Kerman, Balochistan, Isfahan, etc. The peasant movement took various forms. The most common form was the refusal to pay taxes, to pay the landowners a share of the harvest, to perform various duties and disobedience to the Shah's authorities. As the revolution unfolded, the peasant movement assumed more and more decisive forms. Cases of attacks by peasants on the Khan's landowners' estates became more frequent. The peasants seized the Khan's food supplies and divided them among the poor. In the reports of Russian diplomatic representatives from Iran, during the years of the Iranian Revolution, one can find a lot of information about such peasant uprisings. But although during the years of the revolution, 1905 to 1911, the peasant movement took place in different regions of Iran. In general, it should be said that it did not embrace the whole of Iran, did not take the form of a widespread struggle for land and the elimination of feudal land ownership, and did not play a decisive role in the revolution. City in the Iranian Revolution of 1905 to 1911. Far ahead of the village. During the years of the revolution, for the first time in the history of Iran, a labor movement began to emerge. Iranian workers, who worked mainly in small handicraft enterprises, there was no large-scale industry in Iran at that time, and were in very difficult economic and political conditions, took an active part in the struggle for the constitution, and in all revolutionary events, general strikes in the summer of 1906, Tabriz uprising of 1908 to 1909, Resht uprising of 1909, etc. Already in 1906, the printing workers of Tehran organized the first workers' union in Iran. Since 1907, a strike movement of workers and employees began in Iran. In March 1907, there was a general strike of telegraph workers, who demanded higher wages and other demands. In 1908, in the fisheries of Lianozova on the Caspian Sea, unrest and strikes of workers repeatedly broke out, to suppress which the authorities were forced to send detachments of Persian Cossacks. During 1908 to 1910, workers of the Anzali port, loaders, boatmen, Tehran cabmen, printers, tram workers, employees of ministries in Tehran, etc. also went on strike. Iranian workers took an active part in organizing the Revolutionary Democratic Mujahideen Society, close in character and program to social democratic organizations. In 1907, the first social democratic groups also formed in Iran. Organizations of the Mujahideen Society were illegal. They first began to appear as early as 1905 in Transcaucasia, and in the cities of northern Iran, and consisted mainly of petty bourgeois revolutionaries, merchants, lower clergy, small landowners, artisans, peasants, and workers. The Mujahideen organizations were under the strong influence of the Russian revolutionary movement, and through the Gummet organization, they were connected with the Transcaucasian Bolsheviks. The goals and objectives of the society are illustrated by its program, adopted in September 1907 at a meeting of representatives of Mujahideen organizations in Mashhad. This program put forward the following demands: the introduction of universal, direct, equal and secret suffrage, the implementation of the so-called seven freedoms, which were understood as freedom of speech, press, speech, assembly, societies, personality and strikes, confiscation of the Shah's lands, redemption of the Khan's lands and their division among the peasants, 8-hour working day, changing the tax system by introducing a proportional property tax, universal compulsory and free education, and other democratic requirements. But it should be noted that as a result of the predominance of petty bourgeois elements in the Mujahideen society, views and tactics that were erroneous and harmful to the development of the revolutionary movement were widespread: sectarianism, conspiracy and individual terror. The Mujahideen organized several terrorist acts against the reactionaries: the assassination of Atabek Azam in August 1907, the assassination attempt on Muhammad Ali Shah in February 1908, etc. Already in the first years of the revolution, the Mujahideen began to organize volunteer, armed detachments of the Revolutionary Guard, Fidai detachments. Fidai detachments were created under the Mujahideen organizations and consisted of peasants, workers, the urban poor and the petty bourgeoisie. The Transcaucasian revolutionaries rendered great assistance to the Iranian Mujahideen in the organization of the Fidai detachments. The Fidai detachments became the main armed force of the Iranian Revolution. The growth of the socio-political activity of the broad masses of the people also found expression in the form of the creation of legal, often elected from the population, revolutionary democratic organizations in Juman, which initially began to emerge as bodies for monitoring the correctness of the elections of deputies to the First Majlis. The first Anjuman in Iran was created at the end of 1906 in Tabriz. In his election, in the quarters of the city, wide sections of the population of Tabriz took part. The influence and authority of the Tabriz Enjumen soon increased so much that it essentially turned into an elected unofficial authority, which the ruler of Azerbaijan, at that time the heir to the throne, Muhammad Ali, had to reckon with. In November 1906, the Tabriz Enjumen achieved recognition from the ruler of Azerbaijan, and, relying on the support of the broad masses, established actual control over his actions. In Tabriz, a kind of dual power of the governor and Enjumen was created. The Tabriz Enjumen often openly opposed the Shah's authorities, and contrary to them, independently carried out activities that met the interests of the broad masses of the people. He set fixed prices for bread and meat, carried out a reform of weights, persecuted speculators, confiscated grain stocks from speculators, and divided them among the needy. Sent his representatives to the cities and regions of Azerbaijan to organize revolutionary work among the townspeople and peasants. It should be noted that the Tabriz Enjumen, like most other Enjumen, was a bourgeois organization in its composition and nature of activity. In August 1907, the Enjumen of Tabriz refused to accept the new governor of Azerbaijan, Prince Farmanfarm, appointed by the Shah. Through the deputies of the Mejlis from Tabriz, Enjumen systematically put pressure on the Mejlis, demanding the holding of one or another progressive event. The removal of reactionaries from important government posts, etc. On August 24, 1908, the Russian envoy to Iran, Hartwig, in his report to St. Tabriz at the end of July 1907. In fact, all power has long been in the hands of the local Enjumen, the most influential in all of Persia, who had his own branch in Tehran, whose voice all the deputies of the Majlis listened to. Following Tabriz, Enjumens began to be created in other cities and regions of Iran, first in the north, and then in the south. In Tehran, Resht, Mashhad, Shiraz, Isfahan, Kerman, Bandar Bushehr, Bandar Abbas, Sistan, and others. Less significant city and town, wherever there was an Enjumen. Along with the city and regional Enjumens, who carried out work on a city or region scale, Enjumens were created such as political clubs, trade unions, compatriots, various kinds of societies, etc. A huge number of Enjumens arose in the country. In Tehran alone, there were about 140 different kinds of Enjumen. Anjuman covered the broadest layers of the masses. In Jaraft, Kerman province, for example, Enjumen of free settlers and slaves were created. In Tehran there was an Enjumen of servants of foreign embassies and consulates. In Ling, on the coast of the Persian Gulf, Sunni and Shiite Enjumen were formed, etc. Reactionary elements tried to use this a form of organization, and in opposition to the revolutionary democratic Anjuman began to create reactionary Enjumen. Thus, Qajar princes formed Enjumen Qajari. In many cities of Iran Enjumen were organized, consisting of landowners and large merchants. These Enjumen were in favor of cooperation with the Shah authorities and against the revolutionary democratic Enjumen. During the years of the Iranian Revolution, the press received an unprecedented wide development. Only in the first years of the revolution, before the counter-revolutionary coup of 1908, more than 150 newspapers and magazines were published in Iran. After the overthrow of Muhammad Ali Shah, in 1909 over 100 newspapers were also published in the country. Newspapers and magazines were published not only in Tehran and other large provincial cities such as Tabriz, Rasht, Mashhad, Isfahan and Shiraz, but also in many less significant cities in Hamadan, Yazd, Kerman, Ardabil, Khoi, etc. Many of these newspapers and magazines were short-lived and after a few issues were closed. But some of them have been published for several years and have a fairly wide readership. The newspaper Mejlis, which printed reports on the meetings of the Majlis, for example, was distributed in quantities from 7,000 to 10,000 copies. One of the most popular newspapers, Shah Israfil, the Trumpet of the Archangel, had a circulation of up to 5,500 copies. The Tabriz newspaper Enjumen was printed in the amount of 5,000 copies. During the years of the revolution, satirical and humorous magazines and newspapers, which responded to topical political events, were very widespread and enjoyed great popularity among the population. Especially popular was the satirical section called Sharand Parand, all sorts of things, in the newspaper, Shah Israfil. This department systematically published often very witty and caustic satirical poems written in a very expressive folk language, directed against foreign imperialists and the reactionary Iranian order. This and some other newspapers and magazines protested against the enslavement of women, against smoking opium, etc. The humorous magazine Molla Nasruddin, published in Tbilisi since 1906 in the Azerbaijani language, was also very widely distributed in northern Iran and even in Tehran. This magazine was very well aware of the events in Iran, responded to them, and enjoyed the same great popularity as humorous newspapers and magazines published in Persian. In general, during the revolution, the Iranian press played a very important role in the socio-political life of the country, exerting a very strong influence on the formation of public opinion. It was a strong weapon of the democratic strata in the struggle against the imperialists and the Iranian reaction. In connection with the adoption of the constitution, the implementation of certain reforms and the growth of activity of the broad masses of the people, which found expression in the peasant and labor movement, and in the creation of mujahideen organizations, Fidei detachments and enjumans. A regrouping of forces took place in the constitutional camp. The liberal wing, which consisted of the bourgeoisie, the liberal landowners and the clergy, believed that the tasks of the revolution had already been basically solved, and that now it was only necessary to continue the reforms through the Majlis. In 1907 the liberal wing was gradually moving away from the revolution. This departure was completed after the adoption of additions to the Basic Law in October 1907. In the Majlis, more and more attempts began to be made by liberals to pull up the enjumans, belittle their role, and prevent their interference in political affairs. The split in the camp of the constitutionalists had an encouraging effect on the reaction. The policy of the imperialist powers towards Iran also had an effect in the same direction. The Tsarist government sympathized and supported the reactionary Mohammad Ali Shah. At the very beginning of the constitutional movement, the British flirted with the Iranian constitutionalists, and trying to use them in the interests of British politics. To a certain extent outwardly supported them, best in the British mission in July 1906. The mediation of the English chargé d'affaires Grant Duff in negotiations between the Shah and constitutionalists. In fact, the policy of England was determined only by her imperialist interests. England did not strive to strengthen the economic and political independence of Iran, but to preserve and strengthen its semi-colonial, dependent position. How little the British considered the independence of Iran already at the very beginning of the revolution is shown by the following fact. Described from the words of the Iranian Minister of Foreign Affairs Moshe Uldol in Somov's dispatch of February 10, 1906. In late 1905, early 1906, the British sought to so that the Iranian government cede to them on the island of Henjam in the Persian Gulf plots of land that were supposedly needed for the British telegraph. The Iranian government refused to satisfy this demand of the British. Then the English chargé d'affaires of Iran sent a note to the Iranian government, in which he stated that if the Iranian government cedes the plots of land demanded by England, then the English chargé d'affaires vouches for peace among the Arabs of the island. If the Persian government persists, the note said, then the Arabs will revolt, and if the Persians send troops to pacify them, then the chargé d'affaires, ostensibly to protect the telegraph station, will have to call a warship, with the help of which an order will be restored. Since the Iranian government still did not concede, In March 1905 the English cruiser Fox actually arrived at Henjam Island, which was ordered not to let Iranian soldiers on the island, since their appearance could allegedly anger the Arabs. This is what England's respect for the independence and sovereignty of Iran actually looked like at the very beginning of the constitutional movement. Only in order to strengthen their position in Iran and weaken the position of their rival, Tsarist Russia. England, like Tsarist Russia, was interested in preserving the monarchical system of Iran and the relations that had developed by that time between Iran and the imperialist powers. The British even had, just in case, their protégé in reserve, a contender for the Shah's throne, the Qajar Prince Zilla Sultan, the uncle of Muhammad Ali Shah. Later, when the broad masses of the people, led by the bourgeois democratic Anjuman and Mujahideen organizations, began to actively join the revolutionary in Iran, the supporters openly took a position hostile to the revolutionary movement. Already in a telegram, dated February 6, 1907, addressed to the British Foreign Minister Grey, the English envoy in Tehran's Spring Rice, expressing the general wish that the British and Russian governments should avoid interference in the internal affairs of Iran for as long as possible. At the same time spoke in favor of compiling by both governments to plan financial or military measures in case the protection of European life and property would make these measures absolutely necessary. To put it simply, Spring Rice was already calling for a plan to intervene against the Iranian Revolution. On March 9, 1907, Grey, in a conversation with the Russian ambassador in London, Count Benkendorf, said that since the unrest was taking place in the north of Persia, where Russian interests predominate, this gives Russia the right to take measures that are caused by circumstances. And on January 2, 1908, the British envoy to Iran, Marling, already wrote to Grey that Persia is not yet prepared for representative institutions, and will not be prepared for them for another 2 future generations, 3. Thus, the actual attitude of England towards the Iranian Revolution was sharply hostile. It was determined by colonial goals and the desire for enslavement, robbery and violence against the peoples of Iran. In their hostility to the Iranian Revolution, the British imperialists went further than the Tsarist government. Tsarist Russia, until April 1909, refrained from open, armed interference in internal Iranian affairs on the side of the Shah against the Iranian Revolution. As for the British, already during this period of time, they repeatedly resorted to armed intervention, using their military forces against the Iranian revolutionaries. The Karen River, an English warship, was sent in April 1908. The British bombarded the Mekran coast and landed a naval detachment in Jask. In March 1909, British troops landed in Bushehr and made arrests among the participants in the revolutionary movement. Thus, the British imperialists resorted to armed intervention against the Iranian Revolution earlier than the government of Tsarist Russia did. But in an effort to cover up this imperialist policy, sharply hostile to the Iranian Revolution, the British carried on demagogic, hypocritical and deceitful propaganda that they supposedly helped the peoples of Iran to fight for the constitution against the Shah, who was supposedly defended by the Russians, that the Russians crushed the revolution, etc. It is from such false and demagogic positions that the book of the English Iranianist E. Brown, The Persian Revolution of 1905 to 1909, was written. Cambridge, 1910. This gross lie about England's attitude towards the Iranian Revolution has not yet been properly exposed. The British imperialists, who have rich experience in disguising their aggressive, colonial policy, at one time tried to widely disseminate their deceitful, demagogic version, which also penetrated into Russian literature. The facts decisively refute this version, put into circulation by English propaganda. As for the Anglo-Russian contradictions in Iran, the growth of the revolutionary movement in Iran, and the fear that this movement might give a strong impetus to the revolutionary movement in India led to these contradictions beginning to recede. Somewhat into the background, this was also facilitated by another circumstance, the economic and political penetration of imperialist Germany into Iran and the Middle East, which began as early as the end of the 19th century. Already the German project for the construction of the Baghdad Railway, which, according to the plans of the German imperialists, was to serve as the main channel for German penetration into the countries of the Near and Middle East, in the future posed a great threat to the interests of England, as well as Tsarist Russia in these countries. In 1906, the German shipping company organized regular monthly steamship trips between Germany and the Iranian ports of the Persian Gulf. The Germans sought to provide Germany with a lease of a port on the Persian Gulf. The German shipping company, pursuing a policy of low tariffs, successfully competed with the English shipping company. In the early years of the 20th century, several German trading firms settled in Iran. In view of the fact that the transit route to Iran through Russia was closed for German goods, the Germans used the International Postal Convention and began to send a huge number of parcels with their goods to Iran. During the first decade of the 20th century, German imports to Iran increased 10 times. The Germans founded a special joint stock carpet society with branches in Tabriz, Sultanabad, Hamadan, Kerman, Mashhad and Shiraz. This society began to take over the carpet business in Iran. A large carpet factory was opened in Tabriz, around which a whole German quarter soon lined up. Germany offered Iran a loan, sought a concession for the construction of the Baghdad-Karnakin highway, as well as railways. In 1907, the director of the German Oriental Bank, Gutmann, came to Iran and tried to obtain a concession for a period of 60 years to organize a German bank in Iran, which, following the example of the English Shahanshah Bank, could establish trade, industrial and financial enterprises in Iran, would have the right to mint coins and making all payments to the Iranian treasury abroad. Due to the opposition of the Tsarist and English diplomacy, Gutmann failed to carry out his plans. Germany acted in Iran not only directly, but also through Turkey. Back in 1904, Turkey, encouraged by Germany, taking advantage of Russia's failures in the war with Japan, moved its troops across the Iranian border and occupied the Sujbilag region, now Mekabad, and other Iranian border regions adjacent to Lake Urmia, now Lake Rize. Germany set itself imperialistic goals to turn Iran into its colony and use its territory to attack Russia and British possessions. But in an effort to strengthen their positions in Iran, the German imperialists carried on demagogic propaganda and tried to create in Iran the impression that Germany sympathized with the Iranian constitutional and nationalist movement and was interested in strengthening Iran's economic and political independence. The German Chargé d'Affaires Richthofen and other German representatives, in order to win over the Iranian nationalists, demagogically demonstrated their sympathy for them. They portrayed the Germans as sincere friends and patrons of Muslims, used pan-Islamic propaganda, offered help to Iranian nationalists, delivered weapons to them through the Persian Gulf, etc. It must be said that German demagogy had a certain success in the circles of Iranian nationalists. Some prominent Iranian figures, for example, the first and third chairman of the Majlis of the First Convocation of Soni Eddol and Ichima Sultan, the Iranian ambassador in Constantinople Ala Olmok, and others, occupied Germanophile positions and were oriented towards Germany. The Anglo-German contradictions, which became the main inter-imperialist contradictions, pushed Britain towards rapprochement with Tsarist Russia, and contributed to the formation of the Entente. In Iran, the penetration of German imperialism, as well as the fear that the revolution might spread from Iran to India and other countries neighboring Iran, forced Britain to abandon an open struggle with Tsarist Russia and speed up negotiations on Iranian and Middle Eastern affairs in general. Even before the Russo-Japanese War, England made proposals to the Tsarist government on delimiting spheres of influence in Asia. In particular, in an effort to turn southern Iran into its sphere of influence, England was ready to recognize northern Iran as Russia's sphere of influence. However, the international situation at the end of the 19th century still ruled out the possibility of an Anglo-Russian rapprochement. In England, many representatives of imperialist circles staked on an alliance with Germany against Russia. The Tsarist government also did not want to give South Iran to England. As the Russian ambassador Benkendorf stated in one of his conversations with Lansdowne, it saw no reason why its commercial interests should be limited to the northern part of the country. Russian capitalists at that time sought to gain a foothold in Sistan and penetrate into the Persian Gulf region, the Sistan Telegraph and the Russian Society of Shipping and Trade with the Persian Gulf. By the period under review, the international situation had changed dramatically. The Anglo-German contradictions became the main imperialist contradictions. England agreed in 1904 with France, Russia's ally, and was interested in drawing Russia into the Entente. England was also driven to an agreement with Russia by fear of the growth of the revolutionary movement in Iran and India. The defeat of the Tsarist government in the Russo-Japanese War, the Russian Revolution of 1905, and the revolutionary movement in Iran changed the position of Tsarist diplomacy on this issue. In the autumn of 1906, the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Izvolsky, agreed in principle to the proposal to divide Iran into spheres of influence. As a result of the negotiations that followed, on August 31, 1907, an Anglo-Russian agreement was signed on the delimitation of spheres of influence in Iran, Afghanistan and Tibet, which completed the creation of the Entente. By this agreement, the northern, most populated part of Iran, with an area of 790,000 square meters kilometer, to the north of the Karsachery-Isfahan, Yezd-Zulfigar line, at the junction of the Iranian, Afghan and Russian borders, was declared a Russian sphere of influence. Southeastern, deserted, but adjacent to the British possessions and Afghanistan, and therefore important for England from a strategic point of view. Part of Iran, with an area of 355,000 square meters kilometer, southeast of the line Bandar Abbas, Kerman, Burjand, Gazik on the Iranian-Afghan border, constituted the British sphere of influence. The part of Iran located between them was declared a neutral zone. Both sides pledged not to seek concessions of a political or economic nature in the foreign zone and not to prevent their partner from obtaining them. Both sides retained the right to seek concessions in the neutral zone. By that time, oil exploration had not discovered large deposits of oil in the southwestern part of Iran, and the industrial exploitation of oil had not yet been organized. It was in connection with this that England did not insist on the inclusion of the southwestern regions of Iran in its sphere of influence. The agreement also provided for the establishment of control over the income of the Iranian government in the Russian and English zones. At the same time, it was assumed that England and Russia would introduce control in the respective zones in the event that the Iranian government failed to pay payments on loans to the Russian Accounting and Loan Bank or the Shahan Shah Bank. Russia recognized the presence of special interests of England in the Persian Wall and renounced claims to establish its influence there. Afghanistan was included in the British sphere of influence. The autocratic government of Russia recognized it as being outside the sphere of Russian influence, and pledged to use the mediation of the British government. In its political relations with Afghanistan, the principle of commercial equality of both sides in Afghanistan was also proclaimed. England and Tsarist Russia recognized the suzerain rights of China over Tibet, pledged not to interfere in its internal affairs, and to communicate with it only through the Chinese government. Tibet was declared a sphere of British trade influence. The 1907 agreement did not eliminate the Anglo-Russian rivalry in Iran, which continued after that in more hidden forms, manifesting itself very clearly at critical moments, for example, during the Shah's attempt to carry out a counter-revolutionary coup in December 1907, during the defeat of the First Majlis in June 1908, etc. Germany tried to use these contradictions between England and Russia in Iran, trying to tear Russia away from the Entente. This was especially clearly manifested later, in the Potsdam negotiations of 1910, and the Russian-German agreement on Turkish and Persian issues of August 19, 1911. According to which Germany agreed not to seek concessions in the Russian sphere of influence in Iran. And Russia pledged not to oppose Germany in the construction Baghdad Railway, and after the Baghdad Road is connected by a branch line with Karnakin on the Turkish-Iranian border. Ask Iran for a concession to build this line from Karnakin to Tehran. If this condition were met, a direct railway route to Iran would be opened for German exports. The news of the signing of the Anglo-Russian Agreement of 1907 was greeted in Iran with general indignation. Anti-imperialist demonstrations took place in Tehran and other cities. The Iranian Majlis also protested against the division of Iran into spheres of influence. Having established a certain commonality of the political line of England and Tsarist Russia in Iran, the Anglo-Russian Agreement of 1907 thereby deprived the Iranian constitutionalists of the opportunity to use the Anglo-Russian contradictions in Iran to weaken imperialist pressure on Iran as a whole. After the signing of the Anglo-Russian Agreement, the Iranian Revolution, as an anti-imperialist one, faced the united front of Tsarist Russia and England. Later, an agreement was reached between England and Tsarist Russia on granting freedom of action to Russia in northern Iran and England in southern Iran. Speaking against the revolutionary movement in Iran, the official representatives of England and Tsarist Russia justified this by saying that Iran was allegedly not prepared for a constitutional form of government.